going to throw. One-on-one. Davis has it. Touchdown. Carolina wins. Carolina is the Coastal Division champion. Javonte Williams to the left of Howell. He'll send him out into the flat right side. Howell looking, standing tall, lets it go. Man there. Touchdown. Touchdown, Carolina. The pistol. Jackson behind him. Hands off to Jackson. He tried a jump pass, and it's intercepted. Surratt intercepts it. Holy cow, Carolina's going to win. And off to Javonte Williams again. Pops it to the left. Javonte leaps over a man, crosses the 50, trucks over a defender, spins by another. Goodness gracious, he's down to about the 15, and he did absolutely everything in one carry.
Here's the shotgun snap to Aguilar. Drops back. Pressure coming. Aguilar floats it up. Incomplete. No flags. Head on back up the mountain. Carolina wins it in double overtime. Loftus out of the shotgun. Throws to the end zone. Incomplete. Incomplete. The bell belongs to us. Carolina wins it. 47-45 in double overtime.
Bernard fields it at the 26. Heading to the far side. Gio at the 35. Gio, he's at the 50. No, he's not. Yes, he is. Gio is going to take it for a touchdown. Are you kidding me?
What's going on, guys? Welcome into another edition of the Heel Tough Blog podcast for the third straight night coming at you here tonight, a Saturday night, as Carolina with another commitment in their 2026 class. We'll break it down for you, and then we do have to get to the positions of need for Carolina that still remain in this 2026 class. I've got 5 positions that I think Carolina still needs to land at least one guy at in this class in order to complete the 2026 recruiting cycle. Long way to go, though, until then. But Carolina now with 19 commitments in the 2026 class. That has Carolina tied for third most in all of college football right now, currently in the 2026 recruiting cycle. So a lot of work being done in that 2026 class by Bill Belichick and his staff. Clear that they are going to want to bring in a big class once again this offseason, as they just did this past offseason. Because they are clearly going to want to continue to overhaul this roster. And I think that's what you're seeing right now with the guys that Carolina is landing on the 2026 recruiting trail. They go out today and get 3-star edge rusher Ashton Blatt, from Central Catholic High School in Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania. That's a place where Carolina has been before. Mac Brown went there and got A.J. Beatty out of their high school, if you remember that. But he was a guy that didn't last long at Carolina. They were trying to convert him to the offensive side of the ball, never worked out. And he was a guy that transferred. Hopefully, Ashton Blatt, it works out a little bit different for him this time around. I mean, you look at him, 6'4", 230 pounds, has the measurement already. And coming off of a really productive year at the high school level for him, I thought, going in, didn't really know a whole lot about him, but, 32 total tackles, 13 tackles for loss, 7 sacks as a junior, pretty productive. And I think that's something that is pretty encouraging if you are a Tar Heel fan, that you've got that type of production from him. Now the question is, will that production continue, and will he be able to actually expand upon it this year? This is a kind of a trend with Carolina. They've gone after guys that are coming off of 1 year of production, where last year was their breakout year. I think that certainly is interesting for Carolina because, in years past, we've seen guys with multiple years of production, guys that, frankly, have the production, don't necessarily have the measurements. Now, Carolina's going after guys that have the measurements and that don't necessarily have as much production as some of the other guys that we've seen in years past. Maybe they aren't guys who immediately came in as freshmen and made an impact on the varsity team. They're instead guys that have had to wait their time, but have burst onto the scene here in their junior seasons. And that's exactly what Blatt did. I mentioned 6'4", 230 pounds, really love the size. Both, height and weight-wise, I think both of them are where they need to be. 230 pounds for an edge rusher, pretty solid. I mean, you look at the edge rushers that are in Carolina's room as of this offseason, at least the guys that were in spring practice. I mean, you've got Austin Alexander, 6'3", 240 pounds. Daniel Anderson, 6'1", 245 pounds. Chinedu Onyegoro, a little bit smaller as a true freshman at 6'2", 250 pounds. But then you've got Tyler Thompson, a guy who's 6'4", 225 pounds, who Carolina is probably going to count on a little bit this year to be able to provide something. And the same thing for a guy like Jabron Harvey, who, it measures in a similar area, around 240 pounds. So definitely guys that I think are worth keeping an eye on, in terms of where their size is at, if Bill Belichick is looking to add more weight to those guys, and where ultimately that could round out for a guy like Blatt for when he comes to campus. But I think it's probably going to be at least that spot alternate, opposite rather of Price Yates is probably going to have, pretty decent size, but not necessarily overly heavy. Those guys are probably going to be looked at as ones that Carolina wants with a little bit of speed off the edge. And that's what Ashton Blatt brings to the table. I think he uses his length well to keep tackles' hands off of him when he gets to the passer, and does a good job of altering some of those passing lanes from time to time when he gets his hands up. Now, I think that's something you'd like to see him do maybe a little bit more often when he doesn't necessarily get to the quarterback, but that's something that certainly, can be worked on as he gets to the next level. I mentioned, like the speed on him. I think he is a speed edge rusher. I think that's ultimately what he's going to be looked at as, just someone that's going to try to win with the speed off the edge. As of right now, you would hope that he could add a little bit more physicality to his game. That's not necessarily the strength of his game. He doesn't win with a lot of those physical bull rushes. And it's 6'4", 230 pounds. That's not really how most of those guys are going to be able to win. When you're more of the guy that's in that 250, 260 pound range, those are the guys where you're looking for them to be a little bit more physical. But I do think that he does bring a nice level of physicality to his game. It's solid. It's not great. I do think there's room for improvement, like I said. But I do think that, he looks like the type of guy that's going to win more often than not because of his speed on the edge. And I think his speed is pretty solid. He does beat some tackles around the outside. There are some other tackles who do a better job of staying in front of him. So it's not elite speed, and that's something that you would love to see. Similar to, Onyegoro, the guy that I mentioned there a little bit ago, that is a true freshman currently on the roster. He's a guy that has a little more elite speed off the edge. He can win basically by just running past guys because of his speed. I think with Blatt, you saw moments where he was able to do that, but it wasn't necessarily consistent. So you'd like to see him maybe become a little bit more explosive off the edge. I do think that he plays with good leverage. He definitely dips that shoulder, wants to play low. And so I think that's certainly something that's encouraging that you see from him. But yeah, I think one thing that, really shows up is his relentlessness. That's the one thing that I think allows him to get most of his sacks, is that even if he doesn't necessarily win on the initial rush, he is a guy that's still going to keep fighting and trying to get to the quarterback if he still has the ball in his hands. And that's how he got a few of his sacks. And I think that's the thing that Carolina really likes about him, is the motor. The motor is there. There's no question that that's the best element of his game to me, because you see it show up so often in those plays when he's getting after the quarterback. You see it show up when he has to run down plays downfield. There was one play in particular on his film where he runs a guy down from about 40 yards. And this looks like a pretty small running back or slot receiver that he ends up running down. So it shows that he has the commitment to run down any play anywhere on the field, and he's always going to be playing with that constant motor, which is what Carolina really wants. That's what Bill Belichick and his staff have been looking for from the beginning for these guys is, do you have guys that simply play until the whistle is blown? They don't want to see guys that are taking plays off, they're not running to my side, I'm just going to take this play off, try to rest for the next play. They're looking for guys that are looking to get involved in every single play, and that's what you see from Ashton Blatt at the high school level. The question is, will it translate over to the college level? I think it will. I don't think that's going anywhere. I don't think that, that speed rush is necessarily going anywhere. It's about improving in certain areas. I think for him, that will be important. As a run defender, he's aggressive off the edge. I'll give him that, which is something that allows him to get into the backfield and make those tackles for loss. But one thing that he's going to have to prove is that he's able to set the edge as a run defender. If he can prove that, then I think you've got a pretty complete player here. I think you've got a guy that can really make a difference for Carolina after a year or two in the system. It's going to take a little bit of time, I think, as it does with all defensive linemen and offensive linemen. Anybody that plays in the trenches, it usually takes them time to make an impact. But I do think that this is a guy that has all of the measurables. He has plenty of upside. And I think he's definitely a guy that Carolina is excited to get. And when you land him over Penn State, over Virginia Tech, and over Duke. And, Penn State, I think it's important to recognize here that Penn State really tried to go all out, it seems like, to try to land him last weekend, and it didn't end up working out. Carolina is the one that's the beneficiary of it. They get him in midweek, less than a month after he was offered by the team. And Carolina goes from being a team that was just entering the race in the middle of May to being the team that actually ends up landing him and overtaking a team that had been on him for a while in Penn State and a team that had been on him for a while in Virginia Tech. So I think that's a great sign for Carolina. That's something that you should feel confident about as a fan, is that you beat out two teams that, have really produced good defensive linemen year in and year out. That's the one thing. Even though Virginia Tech hasn't been great over the last few years, they are still producing defensive linemen after defensive linemen that goes to the NFL and eventually makes plays. I mean, you saw it with Antoine Powell-Ryland this year, and I think that that's something that's going to keep up. So they were wanting to add this young man to that group. Carolina lands him, and so there is plenty of potential here for him. Now it's about him being able to capitalize on that. So you move on from him, and now, when you look at that edge rusher spot, Carolina with two edge rushers committed in this class, and these are true edge rushers, guys that will play that outside linebacker spot. You've got him and, of course, Xavier Griffin Haynes, the in-state guy, 6'6", 235 pounds. I think those two guys really do make up a really good group here at that edge rusher spot, and I would think that Carolina is pretty much done at the edge rusher spot. I think there's one guy that they would be willing to take on. It'll be interesting to see if they actually do have a legitimate shot here. One thing that was notable is that the one guy that's still out there for Carolina that I believe they would take if he was to want to commit to them would be the edge rusher out of the state of South Carolina, Julian Walker. He's a guy that visited Carolina back on May 30th, took the official visit there. South Carolina has been trending for him for a while, but if he was to want to commit to Carolina, it feels like that Carolina would be more than willing to take his commitment, would find a way to make him work there. I mean, 6'6", 230 pounds, has all the length in the world, has pretty good weight for that size, and I definitely think would be an easy take for the Tar Heels. No questions asked. And he was tweeted at after the commitment yesterday from Julian Burns. That was the first guy that Julian Burns ended up tweeting at. Now, there are other guys, of course, that he's going to probably that he is probably going to try to recruit. But I found it very interesting that he went out of his way to mention Julian Walker and basically said, what are you waiting for? Go ahead and announce that commitment now. So I don't know if those two really hit it off when they were on their official visit together, both guys on campus that May 30th group. that was on campus. I don't know if those guys really hit it off or what exactly happened, but it seems like he definitely was going after him and trying to get him to be the next one that commits to this class. The interesting thing is he did actually take that tweet down, it looks like. Not sure if it's still up there. I'd have to check his replies and mentions, but I do think that that's something to keep an eye on because, and yeah, it actually is still up there. He said, "What's up, bro? Stop keeping these people waiting." So I don't know if that means that they had some sort of agreement that they were going to commit together or something like that, but that certainly is something to keep an eye on. Outside of that, I think Carolina's done. Carolina, as far as I know, does not have any other edge rushers that they're hosting outside of Lawrence Brown, the guy who is on campus currently for Carolina. And he's a developmental guy. You know, Carolina, I think, would take him on because they would just be hoping that he turns into something. 6'4", 195 pounds. I told you that's the lightest defensive end or edge rusher that I've ever seen. And even just looking through the group that Carolina is targeting at the edge rusher position here in this class, I mean, we're not even talking about anybody that's close to that. I mean, you've got Elijah Littlejohn, who is a local guy here who is listed at 6'2", 205. But even that, I mean, especially because he's 6'2", a little bit more stout, and I do believe that he probably has put on more weight this offseason. Lawrence Brown could have certainly done the same, but that definitely looks like one of those positions where if Carolina takes him on, that's just going to be purely an upside pickup. That's one that you wouldn't expect to make an impact here anytime soon. And frankly, they would probably be picking him up because he is a guy that is close with your starting quarterback or your future starting quarterback, you hope, in this class that Carolina ended up landing in Travis Burgess. That's what you would really hope. That if Carolina was taking him on, that was the reason why, was just to basically satisfy him and make sure that he stays committed to this class. But I don't even know if that's necessarily going to be what Travis Burgess is trying to do, but who knows? We'll have to wait and see whether or not Carolina ends up landing him or if Julian Walker ends up committing. If not, I think Carolina's probably done at 2 here. One thing, that I did want to mention is that, with Blatt, at his size, I do think that he is somebody that, won't necessarily be playing immediately, but I do think eventually gets it out there. But yeah, I really like everything about him. I do think that this is someone that could end up trending upward as we go throughout this next season, and he could end up being a guy that finishes inside of the top 500 and is one of those blue chip prospects that we've talked about. Now let's move on to the position of needs that remain still in this 2026 class. Talked to you last night about the guys that are on campus. Some of these positions, you do have guys that are on campus right now that could satisfy some of these needs, but Carolina does still have a few needs in this class, believe it or not, even with 19 commits. And this is going to be a big group. I think you need to expect that. Some years Carolina was bringing in 19 guys, and that was their entire recruiting class. But that was with the previous scholarship limits. Now with 105 scholarships available to Carolina, it seems like they're going to try to use just about every single one of them. And they are going to want to get some high-quality players to put in those spots. So I do think that, there still is a lot of work to be done here in this class. And I think it starts with the linebacker position. To me, that's still the biggest need for Carolina in this class. Right now, they don't have a single linebacker committed. It really depends on what you believe Julian Burns is. And at 6'2", 197 pounds, I would probably put Julian Burns right now at safety until he proves to me otherwise that he is going to play the linebacker spot. That's where, the safety spot is where he plays at the high school level. And so I think right now we have to put him in that safety group. And with that, that means that the linebacker spot, you don't have a commitment in this class. Now, the good news is that you do have a lot of guys that you are targeting at that position. And I do think that this is certainly an area where Carolina is going to turn up the heat as we get closer and closer to the end of this recruiting cycle. I think, as we get through the summer here, once we get all these guys through their official visits, they are going to be pushing even harder to land a guy there. Japri Wafer is the guy who's on campus right now for Carolina. That's a guy who's currently unranked, but hey, if Carolina needs to take someone at the linebacker position, I think that's a pretty safe one that they can take now and then kind of see where things go from there. Always a guy that if for some reason you do need to free up a scholarship, then I do think that Carolina can do that. But, the question is, are they sort of holding out for maybe a bigger name? There are 3 guys right now at the linebacker position that Carolina is looking at that I think they will take, no questions asked, that I think they actually have a legitimate chance of potentially landing, or guys that they are at least in the hunt for, I will say. TJ White, I think, is the most questionable one out of the group, also the most talented out of the group, a guy that is ranked inside of the top 200 players in the country, inside the top 150 actually in the country, looked at as a guy that is, was a visitor back in April, but is probably going to select one of the schools that he's visited here in the month of June. Auburn, Florida State, Tennessee, and Mississippi State, with the in-state Mississippi State Bulldogs being the team that was favored for him for a while. That's going to be a guy that I think Carolina had visit. They would love to get him, but I don't think that's going to necessarily work out. And so then from there, it's really down to 2 guys. It's Calvin Thomas, the linebacker from Cypress Ranch High School in Cypress, Texas, and Adam Balagoon Ali from Cardinal Newman High School in West Palm Beach, Florida. And, I think the one that Carolina probably should feel best about is Balagoon Ali, Carolina hosted him. I know that he took an official visit to Oklahoma last week, and now he's wrapping up, it appears, his official visit schedule with a visit to Kentucky. He will still have an open week available, but it looks like Carolina is in pretty decent shape here with this one. I will be interested to see if there is another school that he actually ends up visiting. Auburn was a school that he visited back on May 16th. That still seems to be in the running. There doesn't appear to be anybody else that's waiting for an official visit from him. So I think Carolina's got a legitimate shot here to end up landing him. And that would be huge for Carolina if they could get that done, because when it comes to Calvin Thomas, that's a guy that I think Carolina's a little bit further out on. They hosted him for an official visit to start the month back on May 30th. And then he went to Michigan, Nebraska, and Texas. I think Texas next weekend is probably where most people will expect him to land. SMU is an in-state school, is another spot. It appears they did a pretty good job on their official visit back on May 2nd. But I think Texas is probably where you would expect him to land when it's all said and done. I think Michigan also did a really good job in that recruitment. So to me, I think Carolina's got to hang their hat on Balagoon Ali, but that is certainly a position where Carolina is in need of at least 1 commitment, potentially 2, depending on what that ends up happening with Julian Burns or what you're really looking for there. I mean, I think Carolina's looking probably to add 1 guy who will play close to the line of scrimmage, will be your run stopper, like they have this year in Andrew Simpson. And then you're looking for 1 guy that's going to be your coverage guy, like Kamori House. And I think that's why you wonder if Burns could potentially be the guy that fills that role. If not, though, then Carolina has to go out and find that athletic linebacker that can cover in space and really take away the opposing passing game. You move on to the cornerback spot. And this is a spot where Carolina already has a commitment in this class. That would be cornerback Marcellus Ryan, who is currently on campus this week. He is taking his official visit. He is a nickel corner, 5'10", 170 pounds. So they're looking for that outside corner. And that's a big part of the reason why they've been handing out a lot of different offers here over the last few weeks and days. Even here recently offering, a guy out of the state of Texas, out of Duncanville High School, that is currently not listed on 24/7 Sports website. But I'll look them up here in just a second. But they handed out that offer last night. They are looking to get as many guys in here as possible. I think in this room, Xavier Jackson, of course, is one name that I think most people are familiar with now after he scheduled an official visit and is on campus right now with Carolina. You do have, he's still considering places like Minnesota and Pittsburgh. Those were two schools that he took official visits to. So Carolina's got their work cut out for him there. But this is one that I think if Carolina wants him, if they do enough this weekend, they could end up landing him. And that could definitely be the answer to what is a need right now. Jeremiah Favorite, one of their recent additions as well, out of Boiling Springs High School in Boiling Springs, South Carolina. One of the top corners in that state, ranked as the number 20 player overall in that state as well. So definitely a guy that, Carolina would like close to home, sort of gets that connection to the state of South Carolina as well. So that's another name to certainly keep an eye on as we move forward. But that cornerback spot, definitely an area where Carolina is needing to add somebody else here in the near future to at least provide some sort of length on the outside. Victor Lincoln Jr. Is the player out of Duncanville High School down there in Duncanville, Georgia. And as you know, Duncanville High School is one of the top teams in the state of Texas, and really is, one of the better schools in the entire country. So Carolina going down there, contacting him. He's currently committed to Oklahoma State. That would be a big flip if Carolina could get it done. One of those three, Carolina, or four if you count Xavier Jackson, one of those ones Carolina is going to have to get done, because it doesn't look like in-state cornerback Kosi Barnes, who they offered a couple of weeks ago, doesn't look like he's going to get to campus. I think South Carolina is probably the safe bet for him. I know Carolina would really love to get an in-state commitment, especially a guy that's from Grimsley High School there in Greensboro, but it doesn't appear like that is going to necessarily happen. The third need that I wrote down for Carolina was the wide receiver position. And this is another position where you may kind of be scratching your head and saying, well, why would you think that the wide receiver position is really that big of a need? It's really just one specific part of the wide receiver room that I think Carolina is still needing somebody at, and that is the outside wide receiver spot. We've seen a multitude of different guys who have taken visits. Calvin Russell, who is one of the top players in the entire country, visited midweek. That's one that Carolina is hoping can potentially solve that need on the outside. Chase Campbell, another guy that Carolina is looking at and thinking can solve that need. Keon Chapman, who visited back on the first week of the month of June. They're hoping he is potentially considering Carolina like that. Jaden Petit, who's on campus right now. A lot of these guys, you look at Petit and Keon Chapman, both 6'4", 195 pounds. Same thing, Calvin Russell, 6'5", 195 pounds. A little bit smaller for Chase Campbell at 6'1", 180, but is that prototypical outside receiver that Carolina is looking for. That's really what they need. And Devin Fitzgerald, a guy who will be on campus next weekend, that might also be a guy that could fill that role for Carolina. But I think they are wanting one of the big fish too. I think they could definitely take on Devin Fitzgerald, but want to bring in another one of those guys that's ranked as a 4, borderline 5-star if you end up getting a commitment from Calvin Russell. So I think that's an area where Carolina still has a need, even though they have 2 commitments in the class with Kamari Miles, the wide receiver out of the state of Georgia, who has a little bit of size on him, can take the top off of the defense, everything like that. And then also do have a commitment from Jaden Jefferson, who's currently on campus for his official visit in the slot. So I think they've got those 2 areas really taken care of. Now it's about finding that prototypical big wide receiver, that number 1 type wide receiver, that X receiver that you need for your offense. And I think that's ultimately what Carolina is hoping they can get from this group of uncommitted guys that they are looking at. You move on to the defensive line. That's another position I still think is a position of need And that's one where, again, people will look at it and say, Carolina's got a good amount of commitments there. Why would you think that they still need someone? I mean, Carolina already with commitments from Trayshawn Ruffin in the middle at 6'2", 340 pounds. Jimmy Frisco a la Suafau, 6'3", 265 pounds, really fills that one edge rusher role that will be filled this year. Really, I would list it as a defensive end position more than anything. You'll have a defensive end and an outside linebacker in this system, which will both be trying to get after the quarterback, but we'll do it in different ways. I think he fits that role. I still think that Carolina could probably use someone else there. David Jackson, 6'2", 276 pounds, but translates more to the middle of that defense, just going to have to add some weight. I think, Carolina would love to have another guy in the middle that can be a space eater, because I think we have some questions about whether or not that guy is on the roster this year. So going out and getting two guys that could potentially do that next year, I think is certainly on the table for them. And that's why they've been going and talking with guys like Vodney Cleveland, who visited campus midweek. Doesn't look like he's necessarily going to be the guy that Carolina is probably going to land. If I had to guess, he's probably going to go to either Florida, which received a crystal ball prediction for him earlier today, or the current school that he's at, Texas, which was hosting him today. I believe had him inside of a Lamborghini. I think that's certainly something that Carolina, I mean, look, they could compete with it. Maybe they did really show him enough midweek, but we haven't really heard anything coming out of that visit, so I don't think that's necessarily the most encouraging thing when it comes to that. Carter Gooden, a guy who will visit next weekend officially. He will visit midweek officially coming up here later on this week. Carter Gooden out of the state of Massachusetts. I think he's a guy that Carolina would certainly take on, ranked inside of the top 300. That's definitely someone that I think Carolina would love to have. And coming out of that Massachusetts area, I think they are going to have a chance to actually land him, considering that that is an area where Bill Belichick's history is known and known very well. I think that's why Carolina is having success there. If he's not the guy, and with his size, it's 6'4", 260 pounds, he'd be another one of those guys that would play that defensive end role for Carolina. They might also be looking to add in the middle. And as I said, I would still look to add in the middle. I think, Tua Fanua, Iona Tana Umokasius, who is on campus right now, is certainly a guy that Carolina is in the running for. Colorado State is the favorite for him, so I think that Carolina could maybe flex a little muscle here as a Power 4 program this weekend and potentially be able to land him. Danny Beal, a guy who visited back in the month of April, is certainly still on the table for Carolina out of the state of Arkansas. That is definitely a guy to watch. He's still taking a bunch of official visits right now, but I do think that Carolina is still in the fight for him. So don't take him off your radar just yet. And then you've got a couple other guys that visited back in the month of April that I think could still be in play for Carolina as well. Manoa Fapusa, who is 6'2", 310 pounds, would fit that almost perfectly, what Carolina is looking for. And then Joseph Pecco, the son of former defensive tackle in the NFL, DeMonta Pecco, who I think would easily be a take at Carolina with the family lineage and with the success that he has had at the high school level himself. He is strongly considering Colorado, which is where he is at currently. I think it really comes down to Colorado and Carolina for him, but that could be a guy that jumps on it. This feels like a position where Carolina is going to host a bunch of guys, and Seven Cloud is a guy that comes out of the community college ranks that I think could be in play for Carolina as well. He is the number one JUCO player in this class, currently committed to Georgia, but Carolina is going to get an official visit in the middle of the week. At least that's what's scheduled. We'll see if that still holds up. So, I mean, a bunch of different options for Carolina here. But as I said, I would still take on one at that defensive end position. I think Carter Gooden is the one that you're really hoping you follow through with and end up landing. And then one of the big guys in the middle of the defensive line. I think that's what you're hoping for to fill out this defensive line room with everything that you've landed so far. The final position that I have as a need for Carolina in this class is still the offensive line. And the reason I just say the offensive line is because there's a lot of different spots that I think Carolina still has to figure out. A lot of different commits where Carolina's got to figure out where exactly they are going to play them. I talked about it a little bit last night. Carolina has 5 commits in this class along the offensive line. I think it's safe to say that Anthony Hall and Zion Smith are 2 guys that they're looking at probably playing on the interior of the offensive line. That's where they're listed. And I think Zion Smith, even though he's 6'4", 290 pounds and does play offensive tackle, I think he translates better to the interior of the offensive line. Then you've got the 3 guys that I think Carolina is going to have to make decisions on. Eli Raquel, who committed last week to Carolina, 6'5", 270 pounds. Actually committed a couple of weeks ago, or now it seems like it's just last week, but it was a couple of weeks ago after his official visit to Carolina back on May 30th. Mason Wilhelm, who committed the day that his official visit ended back on June 1st. He is 6'4", 285 pounds. And then Nick Fiamora, who committed to Carolina a couple of days ago and is 6'5", 295 pounds. Carolina's got to figure out where these guys are going to go. And then from there, figure out where they still need to add somebody in this class. I would still look to add definitely an offensive tackle to this group. I think that's still an area of need. I think the interior of the offensive line, they probably feel pretty good about. But the tackle spot, they are going to lose a lot of guys here this offseason. So, as I said, Thomas Wilder, talked about him last night. He would be the big name that I think would really satisfy a lot of people. Ranked inside of the top 400, ranked inside actually of the top 350, 318th overall, the number 29 offensive tackle in this class. That would be a very nice addition for Carolina. If not him, then I think you probably look in the direction of a guy like Tyreek Jemison, who was on campus last weekend. Carolina, in decent shape with him. I do think that he is someone who's taken a bunch of official visits. So I think Carolina probably likes where they're at with him, feels like they have a good chance to land him, but it's far from a guarantee at this point. And so I think that's definitely one of the things is that Carolina still has to keep looking. Trip Skews is a guy that's a little bit lower ranked, weighs in or measures in at 6'7", 300 pounds. Carolina hosted him back on May 30th, and they're hoping that visit will be enough to outshine some of the other schools that are hosting him for a visit, including Colorado, who is the in-state school for him. So, I mean, there's a lot of guys here. Again, Landon Breedy, a guy that we didn't talk about a lot, even when he was on campus visiting for Carolina. That's kind of the guy that I think, might be the safety player for Carolina if they don't end up landing one of the top guys. If some of those other top guys are trending elsewhere, Carolina may then take on Breedy out of the state of Ohio, who is currently deciding between Carolina and Pittsburgh. But I do think they need at least one more commitment at that offensive tackle spot. And look, if they believe that they have enough offensive tackles, if they're going to put Raquel out there, if they believe that Mason Wilhelm translates out there, you still got the interior of the offensive line where you've got Brandon Anderson, who's visiting this weekend, that Carolina could turn up the heat with, although Tennessee's still in a really good spot for him. You've got Hayden Ainsworth, who you still have to host in the middle of this next week. He'll be on campus, so that's certainly a guy that Carolina is hoping they can get. Nebraska, currently the team that's trending for him after their visit this past weekend, but I do think that Carolina still has an opportunity there if they want it. Those are guys that I think Carolina can still land along the offensive line, and all of them would be very satisfactory towards building the team up and this class up here in the 2026 recruiting cycle. So that's going to wrap it up for this edition of the podcast, guys. Make sure you head over to the website, HeelToughBlog.com. Plenty of stuff up there on the website, including a primer for you guys that if you didn't read, go back and read it of all the guys that are on campus currently. Make sure that you go and check that out so that you know where all of those recruitments stand, even including a guy like Will Conroy, who I didn't mention and should have mentioned for the offensive line group there, who's on campus that Carolina is trying to flip from Oklahoma. So make sure you're reading up on all of those guys on the website at HeelToughBlog.com. Also got the article up there for you guys breaking down Ashton Blatt a little bit more. So make sure that you go and check that article out. We would greatly appreciate you guys doing that. I dissect him even further than I did here on this edition of the podcast. So you definitely want to make sure you're reading and keeping up with all of those commitment articles whenever those come in. And any other news that comes out around the recruiting side of things for Carolina, we will have you covered. Same thing with the on-the-field stuff. Any news that comes out around the current state of the Tar Heels, we are always going to have you covered on that stuff. Right now, we're in that dead period in between spring ball and the start of fall camp. When we got the update the other day from Bill Belichick on where the program's at, we didn't get any injury updates. But if we find anything out like that, we will, of course, pass that information along to you here as we sit in the offseason and now just wait for the start of fall camp. And when that rolls around, of course, we will have you covered. The basketball side of things quieting down a little bit. Some scheduling stuff that's still coming out. We have the ACC-SEC Challenge that was revealed. Go back and read about Carolina getting to match up against Kentucky once again in Rupp Arena for the first time since the early 2010s. So make sure you go back and read that article and check out that edition of the podcast where me and Josh talked about that, Ian Jackson's comments, and a little bit about the house settlement and ultimately what that means for Carolina. So go back, check out that edition of the podcast wherever you get your podcast, just like you can check out the Heel Tough Blog podcast, which you have been listening here to tonight. So that wraps it up once again for this edition of the podcast. Want to thank all of you guys who have watched and listened to this edition of the podcast. And as always, go Tar Heels.